Good evening everyone, welcome to an AUSSIE Cyclone Chasers update. My name's Chris Nitzo. Today is the 10th of January 2014 and we have a fair bit to get through today. A lot of interesting stuff about to happen in the Aussie tropics over the next week to 2 weeks. So let's get into it. Currently in the last few days of satellite imagery, we can start to see a build-up of cloud over here just to the north of the top end coastline. It's this area here that we're expecting to see a tropical low to form if it hasn't formed already. A fairly weak one to start with. It is expected to linger and meander in this region for a couple of days. Now as it does that, it's going to dump a hell of a lot of rain over the Northern Territory's top end coastline. You can see also a cloud signature associated with convergence with the monsoon trough pushing out across the top of the peninsula, and also then we start to see just the hint of some shower and storm activity out here in the northern Coral Sea. Not much happening there yet, but it will do shortly. Looking at the latest synoptic chart, thanks to weatherzone.com.au, we can see the monsoon trough here over the very far northern parts of the continent, just touching on the Torres Strait or Cape York Peninsula near Bamaga, near the top end coastline. A weak low forming right along that in the northwestern Gulf, just like we said it would a couple of weeks ago. It's all happening as per plan. Now, that monsoon trough will also spawn a low out here in the northern Coral Sea or northeastern Coral Sea in a few days' time. But in the meantime, we need to watch this tropical low as it meanders around the northern parts of the top end coastline. And if it remains offshore, there is just the slight chance that it might form into something a little bit more significant. So looking at the latest Bureau of Meteorology update, this was issued today, the Friday of the 10th of January 2014, we can see that the Bureau is already starting to track a weak tropical low, 1006 hectopascals, located over the Arafura Sea, north of the Arnhem District. The low is expected to move towards the west and remain north of the top end of the Northern Territory during the weekend. By Monday, the low is expected to move southwest or south. Now, this is the key here. It's either going to move into the Timor Sea or it's going to move over land. If the low moves into the Timor Sea, the chance of a tropical cyclone forming actually gets higher, as you would expect. If the low moves over land, well, obviously, for obvious reasons, it's not going to form into a cyclone. Now, regardless of really where it moves, we're going to see a lot of rainfall in that region. So let's have a look at some rain potential there over the next 4 to 8 days. So looking at rainfall over the next 4 days, we can really see that tropical low not moving very quickly in any particular direction over at least the next couple of days. And so because of that, it's dumping a hell of a lot of rain in this region here. Now most of that rain remains very coastal, but we could see falls there of 300 to 400 millimeters even in parts of the Northern Territory coastline. Darwin is probably on the western edge of the really heavy stuff. The really heavy stuff is probably likely to be more to the north. However, obviously dependent on that tropical low's movement, if the low moves a little bit closer to Darwin itself, we could actually see some of that heavy rain impinging onto the city itself. Now, in saying that, regardless of where it goes, Darwin's still going to see that 100 to possibly even 200 millimeters over the next 4 or 5 days. Now, if we look on the eastern Queensland coast, we've also got fairly active weather conditions there with showers and possibly even rain periods at times over the Cape York Peninsula in that convergence zone, but also pushing southwards into the North Tropical Coast, Herbert Lower Burdekin and central coast and with Sundays. Also got some more shower and storm activity over inland parts of Queensland. Unfortunately for the Kimberley, most of the Kimberley and the Pilbara, still pretty dry over the next 4 days. This is the key, folks. The 4-day period after that. So now we're looking, if you look here, from the 14th of January to the 17th of January, we are looking at some massive amounts of rain here. We're looking 400 plus millimeters. Some of the models are predicting some stupendous amounts, up to about 600-700 millimeters in that 4-day period for parts of the western top end coast and extending into the northern Kimberley. Now what we expect is the tropical low that forms here over the Arafura Sea to push in a south or southwest direction. Now if it pushes southwest and out into the ocean, we expect it to form into a tropical cyclone. Very high percentage chance of it doing that. Now, if it tracks more to the south, we expect it to dump a lot more rain. So it's basically a catch-22. Do you want the really, really heavy rain, or do you want the cyclone? And I'm sure for most of the folks in this region, probably want the rain. So for that to happen, we need that system to push in a more southerly direction. Now, at this stage, model guidance overall is suggesting that that's going to happen. However, there is that off scenario that the Bureau just mentioned, that if it remains in the Timor Sea, it is likely to at least increase its chances of forming into a TC. Now, also, as the system pushes south, we get a lot more moisture feeding into the central parts of Western Australia, so we're going to see some big rainfalls in regions that don't normally receive much rainfall. And also, with that pushing south, it's going to drift the monsoon trough southwards with it, and we're going to see some very heavy rain over central parts of the Northern Territory, as well as the southwestern Gulf country. And also in Queensland, interesting to note, the coast starts to clear up in the 4 to 8 day period. And the reason being is because we have a tropical low that forms in the Coral Sea, pushes in a south to southwest direction, and basically starts to hog all the rain off the offshore. And so what we get over the rest of Queensland is a dry southerly airstream. And because of that, we don't see much moisture or much potential for rainfall because that pushes in a lot of dry air, and obviously once we get that dry air, clouds struggle to form. Now, on the coast, though, just the extreme coastal fringe, that air still has a little bit of moisture coming in off the ocean from the south-southeast. So there is still the chance of some coastal activity, more so in the far northern parts of Queensland as opposed to central and southern parts of Queensland. So if I show you what the Bureau is struggling with a little bit is the variability in the model guidance that it's getting. So this is the Bureau's Access regional model, and we can see that it develops a broad tropical low here just north of the top end coastline. Now that's by tomorrow morning. By Sunday morning, we see that low further develops and pushes in a westerly direction north of the top end coast. Now it has ample opportunity there to develop into a TC, and that's exactly what this model does. It actually develops it into a tropical cyclone in the 48 to 72 hour period, and you can see here it's around about 990 hectopascals on the Monday morning to the north of basically the Tiwi Islands. And because of that, and because it remains well north, it actually forms into a TC. Now that's something that some of the other models aren't suggesting anywhere near as strongly, and so some of the more reputable models like the European model has been very hesitant in developing this into anything at all and pushes it directly southwards into the Northern Territory. And so I guess most of the models develop this into some type of system, some type of cyclone, but the most reputable go-to model suggests not, and so therefore I think we've got a situation there where the Bureau is sort of tied between the models, and knowing that one constantly outperforms the other and is showing something very different to the others makes it a very difficult job of deciding what this is going to do. So if we take a look at this other guidance that I'm talking about, we see that the low develops here, but it remains very monsoonal in nature and pushes directly south in the territory, and then pushes southwest along the Kimberley coastline, or just inland of the Kimberley coastline. Now, if the system can remain out here for a bit longer, it does have the potential to form into something much more significant. But the point is that this guidance from I guess the world's leading model is suggesting that the system pushes south very quickly and isn't allowed to do that. And by this particular track, if it follows this particular track of a southward move from its current location north of Arnhem and into this particular region here. So if it follows that particular track, you're going to see massive, massive rainfalls, especially because it's attached to a very strong monsoonal pulse of wind coming through. So we're going to see, that's why we're seeing those model guidance rainfalls suggesting 3, 4, 5, up to 700 millimeters in parts. So we have a situation here where this could be a massive rain producer for the far northwestern parts of the continent. Now you should be able to notice also that on the eastern half of the continent we have this little tiny low here over the central half, or the central parts of the Coral Sea. This particular low is expected to form in about 2 to 4 days time, somewhere up here near the Solomon Islands. It's expected to track in a southerly direction, And if we track it here using the latest Euro model guidance, we can see there it is developing in about 4 or 5 days time and pushes in a south to southwesterly direction and sort of just lingers here in the central Coral Sea until something pushes it either way. And so we've got a situation here where the model has been very firm on this particular system developing, getting marginally close to tropical cyclone strength, maybe slightly less than that, so just a very strong tropical low. And look, the longer term guidance does push this in a southwest direction and does make landfall or get very close to making landfall in the southern or central parts of Queensland. However, that sort of model guidance that far out can be fraught with danger, and we do need to take it with a grain of salt. But overall, we are looking at a tropical low developing, forming, pushing in a south to southwest direction here over the Coral Sea. If we look at the steering pattern for the Coral Sea system, we see an upper trough over the next couple of days is going to keep things very unfavourable. But as we head later into the forecast period, we actually see an upper level high develop, or basically this upper high here pushes into southeastern parts of the continent, and that creates that change in the steering flow. So rather than pushing the system southeast, which is what we expect normally with these Coral Sea systems, we've grown to expect it at least, that particular high being located in that region is going to push the system in a more westerly direction, or at least a southwesterly direction. And so the system will start to track in a south and then southwesterly direction. Now what happens in the longer term is the doubtful part though. So while we expect this type of track, we don't know whether that's going to continue and go bang into there, or whether it stops dead where it is and it tracks from here and it tracks in possibly more of a south to southeast direction. Either way, at this point in time, we can say that there's going to be some fairly decent swells here. Even if the low doesn't become a TC, there's going to be some really strong winds and some swells here over southeastern Queensland because of the pressure gradient between a high pressure system in the Tasman and the low itself up here in the central Coral Sea. We're just not sure yet on landfall though, and that I guess is the key that everyone wants to know, is where it's going to hit and whether it's going to hit, where it's going to hit, and how strong it's going to be. We can tell you the strength of the system is unlikely to be very strong, and the reason it's unlikely to be very strong is there is a lot of wind shear in that particular region. Once it gets about south of Bowen, we're going to see a lot of vertical wind shear. So here's our tropical low in about 7 days time, and right there is where the centre is. You can see that it is even packing some potentially gale force winds well away from the centre, so it's really a monsoonal ugly looking thing in about 7 days time. And what we then look at is what the upper level conditions are like where it's tracking, and it's tracking in a southerly direction and then eventually expected to track in a more southwesterly direction. But it's tracking into an area that's much more unfavourable for development. And if we have a look at what I'm talking about, if we look at the wind shear values at that time, we're going to see that while it's up here in the northern Coral Sea, it's got some pretty good conditions for development. But as it starts to head more in a southerly direction, we're starting to see more and more wind shear in the Coral Sea. We're starting to see wind shear of 25 to 35, even up to 45 knots in parts. And that particular wind shear is not going to be conducive for development. So while the system starts to develop and actually becomes quite a strong monsoonal low in the northern Coral Sea, as it pushes into the central Coral Sea, it starts to be sheared away, and what happens is the tops of its storms get blown away, and so it can't develop strong thunderstorms over a central point. Without that, and that's a key feature of a TC, it has to have those development of that thunderstorm activity right over the centre. With wind shear, it's going to drag all the really strong storms away to one side of the centre, and because of that, that is currently the biggest limiting factor of this system developing in the longer term. Once again, we can't give you long-term directions. We can't say it's going to hit Mackay, or we can't say it's going to hit Gladstone or wherever, because of the simple fact that the guidance out to that particular time frame is a little unreliable, and we're starting to see some signs of perhaps it's not as clear cut as it was a day or two ago, where most of the model guidance was showing a coastal crossing. Now it's starting to be a little bit more iffy. The other thing as we head towards central parts of the Coral Sea is this dry air, and tropical cyclones need a lot of moist air, and they need it through a large chunk of the atmosphere. We can see that as it heads further south, as I said, the Bowen area is about the cutoff. Once it gets south of Bowen, things become very unfavourable very quickly. If we take a much larger look at the moisture in the Coral Sea and in the southern Coral Sea, as this heads, if you're worried about it heading towards southeast Queensland, we can see that there's a lot of very dry air in southeast Queensland. It's going to need this tongue of moist air to come down with it and circulate around it, because if this dry air gets caught up in the circulation will die. Once again, if we take a larger look at wind shear at the time next Friday, we can see that around that southeast Queensland area and in the southern Coral Sea, there's wind shear of over 40 knots in the area, so that's pretty high. It's not going to allow the cyclone any chance of further development unless the shear abates, and at this point in time we're not seeing too many signs of the shear going away anytime soon. So northern Coral Sea, if it can remain out here, it's going to develop further, but as the steering flow starts to track it in a more south and then southwest direction, it's going to push it into a more unfavourable area for further development, and in fact it's likely to even weaken the system as it pushes in a more southwest direction. So if we look at the GFS model for the GFS ensemble for next Tuesday morning, we do see just the slight hint at maybe a low pressure system making landfall or getting close to land, at least over the southeastern parts of the state or the central parts of the state. Now, bearing in mind this is looking a long way out, and as I said, there's so much going against this system from actually being a cyclone at landfall. We don't expect it to be one. However, the Coral Sea does show us time and time again how difficult it is to predict, just because there's so many new patterns and dynamic changes to the atmosphere, particularly in the middle and upper levels that comes off Australia. So we get little upper lows that develop out of nowhere, we get little troughs, the shortwave troughs that develop out of nowhere that we don't tend to see as much in the Timor Sea or in the Southeast Indian Ocean. We tend to see them a lot more in the Coral Sea, and that's why it's so fraught with danger when we start looking out too far ahead in the Coral Sea. So forgive us if we're not going to give you a landfall region for this one, because at this stage we don't know if it's going to hit land, and if it does hit land, we don't know how strong it is, but we expect it to be reasonably weak. Looking at the European ensemble, pretty similar story, except that they've got the system a little bit more to the north, at least their ensemble members. But you can see a fair bit of doubt and variability in the guidance as to where this system will be located next Sunday. And but overall, one thing that all the guidance is showing us is that no matter what it's going to do, it is expected to remain reasonably weak, regardless of wherever it goes. Now remember, for it to be a strong system, it has to stay in the northern Coral Sea, because once it gets down here, it's got dry air and it's got wind shear, and both of those aren't going away in a hurry. So folks, at this stage, don't stress about it. Be aware that it is going to develop, and be aware that it is going to intensify as it's in the northern Coral Sea in nice conditions, but also be aware that as it approaches, if it approaches the coastline, it is expected to undergo some pretty dodgy conditions, and therefore we would be very surprised, we're not ruling it out completely, but we would be very surprised if it approached the coast as an overly strong system. If it does approach the coast, we would expect that areas to the south are going to see most of the wind in a fairly strong pressure gradient between the high here and the low here. So anywhere in this particular region we'll see some very strong winds and some fairly heavy rain, particularly if the system pushes onshore. As you can see also on the west coast, we do still have the potential for that NT low, if it does track south or southwest, to be located here near the Pilbara coastline. Now remember, if it gets off the coast, there is always a chance it will form into a TC. Same thing here, if it doesn't actually push south and it pushes more southwest, always a good chance of it forming into a TC. At this stage, the reliable guidance says that's not going to happen, but some of the other models suggest that it still could happen. Alright folks, that's all from us today. We'll start issuing these daily now because things are getting interesting in the tropics. So our next update will be Saturday evening. Good night, and thanks for watching.